Avery Cole sat on the wooden porch of her small Wyoming ranch, the early morning sun spilling over the rolling plains and casting long golden shadows across the land. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh grass, a scent that was foreign to her after years spent amid dust, smoke, and the acrid tang of gunpowder overseas. Here, she was anonymous, just another face in a quiet town, a woman who raised horses and tended her land with meticulous care. Few knew that Avery had once been among the Navy's elite, one of the rare women to serve as a SEAL in combat operations. The locals only knew her as Ms. Cole, a reserved woman with strong hands and a quiet demeanor. Children would wave as they passed, and she would nod in return, never offering more than a polite smile. She had chosen this life for a reason, to escape the chaos and the weight of responsibility that came with being trained to survive in some of the deadliest environments on Earth. Here, she could breathe, think, and exist without the constant threat of violence. Her day began with routine, something that grounded her in ways that war never had. She saddled her chestnut mare, Dakota, and led her to the pasture. Avery's hands moved with calm precision, brushing the horse's mane, checking her hooves, and whispering soft words that only the animal could understand. This was her therapy, her connection to life that was simple and real. The ranch demanded discipline. Fences had to be mended, crops watered, animals fed, and the rhythm of work replaced the rhythm of war, offering a sense of normalcy she had long yearned for. Despite the calm, Avery remained vigilant. Old habits die slowly, and years of combat left their imprint. She scanned the horizon as she walked the perimeter, noting the slight dip in the land where wild deer might cross, the distant ridge where a storm could gather unnoticed. Every sense remained alert, honed by training that had saved her life more times than she could count. Here, it felt unnecessary, almost paranoid, but Avery knew instinct rarely rested. And that's what had kept her alive all those years. Her mornings were spent in quiet reflection as well as labor. She would take a mug of coffee, steaming in her hands, and sit under the vast Wyoming sky, letting the silence envelop her. There were no deadlines, no mission briefs, no enemy fire, only the soft rustling of wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. She thought of those she had lost, the friends who would never walk out of the battlefield alive, and a quiet ache settled in her chest. Even here, miles from the chaos, memories lingered, sometimes unbidden, sometimes sharp like the edge of a blade. By noon, Avery had finished chores and returned to the small cabin she called home. She prepared a simple meal and ate alone at the worn wooden table. She often thought about the irony of her situation. Trained to survive in environments where one mistake could mean death, now she worried about fences breaking or cattle wandering off. She smiled to herself, a quiet acknowledgement that life, in its gentlest form, could still be dangerous, just in very different ways. The afternoons were spent on maintenance, fixing the leaky barn roof, tightening screws, sharpening tools, the work giving her both purpose and peace. The repetition was meditative, and the satisfaction of a job well done, tangible. Even the quiet rustle of the horses in the stalls felt like a reward for enduring so many years of noise and chaos. But Avery knew peace was fragile. She had learned over countless deployments that danger often arrived when it was least expected, that complacency could be deadly. She carried this lesson like a shadow, even here, where threats seemed improbable. Every crack of a branch, every sudden gust of wind across the plains, made her senses prick, reminded her of nights spent in hostile terrain, when survival depended on noticing details others might miss. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the distant mountains, Avery sat again on the porch, Dakota grazing quietly beside her. She watched the colors shift from gold to deep orange, then to dusky violet, feeling a rare sense of contentment wash over her. Here, in this small corner of the world, she had carved out a life free from the relentless pressure of missions and orders. She was just a woman and her horses, her land and her solitude. Yet, there was always a tension beneath the calm. Avery couldn't ignore it, the way a predator senses an intruder long before the prey does. She had survived ambush, insurgents, and treacherous terrain, and one lesson was clear: danger could appear when least expected. She had trained herself to act swiftly, decisively, and without hesitation. The muscles and reflexes that had once guided her through deserts, jungles, and war zones were still alive, dormant but ready. As night fell, the Wyoming sky exploded with stars, pure and cold. Avery lit a small lamp inside the cabin, watching shadows dance on the walls. The wind carried the faint sounds of distant wildlife, the occasional howl of a coyote, and the whisper of trees swaying in the darkness. She felt a twinge of anticipation, the subtle premonition that life was about to shift, that her carefully constructed solitude might soon be disrupted. And then she saw them. At first, just a glint of headlights far across the plain. She squinted, heart steady, instinct already kicking in. The vehicles moved closer, rumbling over the gravel road toward her ranch. Avery's fingers brushed the edge of the table, testing the weight of the knife she kept nearby. For the first time in months, a pulse of adrenaline surged through her, familiar and cold and exhilarating. Someone was coming, uninvited, unaware that the woman they thought vulnerable was anything but. Avery rose slowly, letting the dim light reveal her silhouette. Her calm demeanor remained, but her mind raced, calculating every variable, assessing every risk. She was no longer just a retired SEAL. She was a protector of this land, of the peace she had fought so hard to earn. And whatever was coming, she would meet it not with fear, but with the skill and precision that had once made her one of the Navy's most formidable operators. In that quiet Wyoming night, the ranch held its breath, and Avery Cole stood ready, the legacy of a lifetime in combat coiled like a spring. The storm, literal or metaphorical, was approaching, and she would face it as she had faced all dangers before, head-on, unwavering, unstoppable. The headlights on the horizon grew brighter, bouncing off the uneven ground and cutting sharp lines through the dense Wyoming night. Avery's instincts, honed over years of covert missions, flared instantly. She stepped silently into the shadows of her barn, letting the darkness cloak her. Her eyes scanned every detail, the glint of metal, the flicker of movement, the telltale crunch of gravel under boots. She had learned to read threats before they revealed themselves, and right now, something was very wrong. Meanwhile, Rick Dalton's crew hurtled across the plains in a battered pickup, adrenaline and panic thick in the cab. Dalton, a wiry man with scars from prison fights and street battles, slammed the wheel as he cursed under his breath. The deal they'd attempted outside Cheyenne had gone sideways. A rival gang had ambushed them, leaving one man bleeding in the backseat. They needed a hideout. Fast. Their plan was sloppy, desperate, and driven by fear. Dalton's eyes fell on the small ranch tucked behind a cluster of trees. "There," he said with a smirk, "that place looks abandoned. We'll lay low for the night." The crew laughed nervously as they approached Avery's property, assuming no one could hear them, no one could see them. They didn't know that quiet did not equal vulnerable. The barn door, weathered and slightly crooked, loomed ahead like a weak point in an otherwise tranquil fortress. Dalton's hand rested on the pistol tucked into his waistband. Confidence and arrogance mixed with desperation, a lethal combination. Inside the barn, Avery waited. She had long anticipated that the peace she had carved for herself might be broken. Every shadow, every sound was a signal. She crouched low behind a stack of hay bales, her hands resting near the knives she had sharpened that morning, her breath steady. The creak of the barn's hinges told her more than words ever could. Intruders. Armed, inexperienced, reckless. Perfect. Dalton and his crew smashed the door open, their boots kicking dust and splintering wood. "Hey, anyone here?" Dalton's voice was loud, brash, meant to intimidate, but Avery remained still. He waved a hand at his crew, laughing, thinking the house empty. "We just need a place to crash for a few hours," he said. The air felt wrong to Avery, almost thick with ignorance. They had stepped into her territory, and she knew instinctively that they would soon regret it. The men moved carelessly, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes scanning for valuables. They didn't notice the faint shimmer of moonlight on metal tucked behind hay bales. Avery's rifle, cleaned and ready. They didn't notice the subtle shift in the barn's air, the way it seemed to grow heavier with tension. Dalton reached the center of the barn, throwing a mocking glance at the shadows. "Looks like nobody's home, boys," he said, smirking. "Easy score." Avery emerged from the shadows in a flash, calm and deadly. One moment she was still. The next, she had disarmed the nearest man, snapping his wrist back with precision that made him howl in pain. "You're trespassing," she said softly, eyes unblinking. Her voice carried authority and a promise of consequences, a tone only someone trained to kill and survive could manage without raising it in anger. The crew froze. Dalton's confident smirk faltered. Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "I said I'm Avery Cole," she replied, almost too quietly. Her calm unnerved them more than the sudden violence. Dalton laughed nervously. "Yeah, right. Nobody lives here but an old lady." He waved a hand, signaling his crew to advance. "Let's show her who's boss." That was the mistake that cost them everything. Avery moved like a shadow, her body low, her hands precise. In seconds, another man was disarmed, his rifle skittering across the barn floor. Dalton's crew staggered back, disbelief and fear mingling in their faces. They had expected a weak, frightened woman, and instead found a predator, coiled and ready. Avery's mind raced through tactical possibilities, every movement deliberate. "You're in my house," Avery said, her voice cold, steel under calm. "And I don't negotiate with threats." Dalton's laughter faltered. His bravado, built on fear and past dominance, crumbled in the face of a woman who had faced death far more directly than he could imagine. He motioned his crew forward, but hesitation had already taken root. They didn't know the terrain, the environment, or the opponent. They had stepped into a trap they could not see. The first firefight was silent, brutal, precise. Avery disabled two men using hand-to-hand techniques she had perfected during training. Each move was calculated, exploiting their inexperience, their arrogance, their overconfidence. They tried to scramble for their weapons, but she was faster, anticipating their every reaction. Dalton barked orders, his panic rising with each second that passed. The barn, once silent and serene, became a stage for controlled chaos. By the time the confrontation ended, two of Dalton's men were incapacitated, bound with zip ties Avery had kept in her emergency kit. Dalton himself was retreating toward the barn entrance, rage and disbelief on his face. He realized, with dawning horror, that they had made a grave mistake. They had chosen the wrong house, the wrong victim, the wrong night. Every muscle in Avery's body was coiled for the inevitable next move, and she watched him carefully, studying his patterns, reading his fear as clearly as a map. Avery's calm exterior never faltered. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't revel in their fear. That was not who she was. She was a soldier, trained to neutralize threats efficiently and effectively, and to protect what mattered. Her ranch, her horses, and her fragile peace were non-negotiable. Dalton and his crew had crossed a line, and she would ensure they understood that in no uncertain terms. Dalton backed out of the barn, shouting for his remaining men to follow. Avery's voice followed him, soft but firm. "You're leaving because I let you. Remember this night, and remember who you threatened." The message was clear. Survival depended on respect, caution, and understanding the weight of underestimating a trained Navy SEAL. As the truck roared back onto the gravel road and vanished into the darkness, Avery exhaled, finally allowing herself a brief moment of relief. But she knew this was only the beginning. Dalton would not forget. His pride would demand a return, and she could expect another encounter, one that would test every skill she had honed, every instinct she relied upon. The quiet life she had built in Wyoming was fragile, and now it had been tested. Avery returned to the barn, checking her weapons, tidying the scene. Her heart rate had settled, but the old adrenaline buzz lingered, a familiar companion. She walked back to the porch as the first hints of dawn colored the sky, knowing that the peaceful existence she had fought so hard to create was no longer guaranteed. This night had been a reminder. Danger finds those who are ready to face it, and for Avery Cole, being ready was the only way to survive. She poured a cup of coffee, watching the plains awaken, the wind whispering secrets only she could hear. Somewhere out there, Dalton was plotting, thinking he had been defeated. But Avery knew better. The rules of engagement had shifted, and the next chapter would not favor the reckless. Her quiet life might be under threat, but Avery Cole had faced death countless times, and she would not be intimidated, not here, not now. As the sun rose over Wyoming, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Avery stepped into the light, calm, alert, and prepared. The wrong house had been entered, the wrong woman had been challenged, and a storm, far greater than the one outside, was quietly gathering on the horizon. The night air hung thick with tension, carrying the smell of wet pine and the metallic tang of fear. Avery Cole had thought the worst of Dalton's crew had retreated, but instincts honed from years in the SEALs warned her otherwise. One of the intruders lingered, hiding in the shadows near the barn, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The subtle shift in the night, a broken twig underfoot, the whisper of wind through a loose board, told Avery that he was close and that he was dangerous. Suddenly, a movement to her left. Avery turned, calm and precise, but before she could react fully, a cold, unyielding metal pressed against her temple. Her breath hitched slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of the threat. The intruder, a wiry man with tattoos running down his arms, smirked with a mix of arrogance and inexperience. "Not so tough now, huh?" he sneered, trying to unsettle her. Avery's eyes remained unblinking, a steady blue storm of focus. "You don't want to do this," she said softly. Her voice carried no threat, yet every word weighed heavily in the air between them. The man's grip on the gun tightened, unaware that he had walked into the den of someone whose life had been built on surviving and thriving in lethal situations. Memories surged, unbidden and vivid. The blistering heat of deserts, the deafening roar of helicopters over enemy lines, the stench of blood and sand in conflict zones. Every mission, every life saved and lost, had taught her one thing: hesitation was deadly. She shifted her weight subtly, aligning her body in a way that would allow her to act instantly, decisively. Her muscles tensed like coiled springs, ready to unleash trained force. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Avery said, her voice calm but cutting. The man's grin faltered. I've handled worse," he stammered, though his confidence wavered. It was a lie, and he knew it. Avery's gaze was unrelenting, a silent promise that anyone foolish enough to underestimate her would regret it instantly. In a blur of motion, Avery struck. Her elbow drove into the man's ribs with pinpoint precision, eliciting a grunt of pain. His gun wavered, a dangerous wobble, and she seized the opportunity. With practiced grace, she twisted his arm, leveraging his momentum against him. Bones snapped audibly under her control, and the weapon fell to the ground with a metallic clang. The man collapsed, clutching his arm, gasping in shock and pain. Dalton's remaining men froze, watching from the shadows, disbelief etched across their faces. They had expected fear, submission, chaos, not calculated precision. Avery's movements were smooth, controlled, lethal, without waste. "You really thought you could threaten me in my own home?" she said, voice low and steady. The words were simple, but in them lay the weight of experience, a promise of consequences that the men could not ignore. Dalton shouted from the edge of the barn, fury lacing his voice. "Get her, now!" But his commands were met with hesitation. The remaining men were inexperienced, untrained, and terrified. Avery had already disarmed one, and the precision of her strikes against human targets, taught, drilled, and perfected over years, made them reconsider their boldness. Fear spread among them, infectious and immediate. The barn, once quiet and serene, now hummed with tension. Every creak of wood, every rustle of hay, sounded like thunder in the intruder's ears. Avery's senses were acute. She could feel the sweat on their foreheads, the tremor in their hands, the rapid heartbeat that betrayed their bravado. She moved silently, swiftly, positioning herself between them and the exit. Her body was a blur, her strategy unseen, her calm the anchor of lethal inevitability. The man with the broken wrist whimpered in pain, realizing the consequences of his arrogance. Avery didn't gloat. She simply observed, waiting for the right moment to neutralize the remaining threats. Dalton's crew, now panicked, attempted a haphazard retreat. One stumbled over a pile of hay, another overbalanced on the wooden floorboards. Each misstep was another advantage for Avery, another chance to assert control over the chaotic scene. "You should leave," Avery said to Dalton from the shadows, her voice steady but filled with authority. "This isn't your fight. Walk away now, and maybe you survive." Dalton, chest heaving with rage and disbelief, waved his men forward in a desperate attempt to regain dominance. But Avery anticipated every move. She sidestepped, pivoted, and incapacitated another man in a fluid, seamless motion. Each strike, each block, each movement had the weight of life and death experience behind it. Time slowed in the barn. Every second counted, every heartbeat amplified. Avery's training allowed her to see threats not as chaotic, but as patterns to exploit. The intruder's fear, their inexperience, their underestimation of her, all became tools she used with surgical precision. She controlled the battlefield not with noise or bluster, but with calm, deadly efficiency. Dalton's shouts grew frantic. "Stop her! Stop her!" But Avery was already 2 steps ahead, controlling the environment, manipulating the space, using the barn's layout, the shadows, the hay bales, everything to her advantage. Within minutes, the remaining intruders were incapacitated or in retreat, staggering into the night with fear coursing through their veins. Avery stood in the center of the barn, unscathed but alert, the faint metallic scent of blood and sweat lingering in the air. Her gaze swept over the scene, ensuring no threat remained. Her pulse had returned to normal, though a familiar rush of adrenaline lingered, a reminder that she was alive, aware, and undefeated. Dalton's crew had learned, painfully, and perhaps permanently, why threatening a Navy SEAL was never a gamble they could win. In the aftermath, Avery collected her weapons, checked for injuries, and ensured the incapacitated men were secure enough to prevent immediate danger. She didn't take satisfaction in pain or fear. Her satisfaction came from control, from knowing that a calculated response and neutralized a potentially deadly situation. This was survival, pure and unadorned. As dawn crept over the plains, painting the sky with pink and amber, Avery stepped onto the porch. She gazed across the horizon, her eyes calm, resolute, and unflinching. Her peaceful life had been interrupted, yes, but it was not defeated. The world outside still posed threats, still demanded vigilance, still tested limits. And Avery Cole, Navy SEAL, survivor, protector, was ready for whatever came next. Somewhere in the darkness, Dalton regrouped, unaware of the full extent of Avery's capabilities. He would return, but he would never forget. And Avery, ever alert, ever disciplined, prepared silently for the next storm. She had survived before. She would survive again. The night had been a warning, one she hoped the intruders understood, though she knew they likely wouldn't. In that quiet Wyoming dawn, with horses grazing softly in the paddocks and wind sweeping across the plains, Avery breathed in the air a mixture of triumph, tension, and anticipation. Her fight was far from over, but she remained unshaken, steadfast, and ready, the epitome of a SEAL who knew that the battlefield never truly ended, even when the war seemed distant. The first light of dawn barely pierced the thick pines surrounding Avery Cole's ranch, yet she didn't need it. Years of training had taught her to navigate terrain with instinct, to read the faintest signs of movement in shadows and foliage. Dalton's remaining men had fled into the forest, scrambling over roots and rocks in a desperate attempt to escape the wrath of the Navy SEAL they had so arrogantly underestimated. Avery moved silently behind them, her footsteps muffled by damp earth and fallen pine needles. Every crack of a branch, every disturbed stone, told her more than words ever could. Her senses were razor-sharp, honed by countless nights in hostile territory, and she tracked their every movement as easily as if she had memorized the terrain. These men were reckless, untrained, and panicked, all advantages she exploited without hesitation. She didn't rush. Speed was irrelevant. Control was paramount. She remembered her instructors in Bud S, drilling the lesson over and over. Anticipation beats reaction. She watched their body language, the way they communicated silently with hand signals, their breathing rapid and shallow. Fear made them predictable, sloppy, exposed. With every step, Avery's calm grew, and the men's terror became a beacon in the dim forest light. Dalton, the leader, had been shouting directions, trying to corral his men, trying to regain some semblance of order. But his commands rang hollow against the relentless precision of Avery's pursuit. He was beginning to understand, in a creeping, terrible way, that his experience on the streets and in prison counted for nothing here. She was methodical, patient, and unyielding. The chase was hers, the forest her battlefield, and the rules were hers alone. A low snap of a twig drew her attention. She froze, barely breathing, her eyes scanning. One of Dalton's men had fallen behind the group, struggling over a fallen log. Avery seized the moment. In a fluid motion, she closed the distance silently, crouching low and using the underbrush as cover. She grabbed the man's arm and twisted, a practiced move taught in combat schools, rendering him helpless without firing a shot. He collapsed to the ground, groaning, and Avery bound his hands quickly with zip ties she carried in her vest. The others had no idea what had happened. The fear spreading through Dalton's group was palpable. Dalton cursed under his breath. Keep moving. Don't stop. But the terrain betrayed them. A fallen tree here, a steep embankment there. They were not soldiers. Their fear made them sloppy, and Avery exploited it at every turn. She moved like a shadow among shadows, anticipating their panic-driven decisions, staying always one step ahead. As they pushed deeper into the pines, Avery assessed her environment. The forest was dense, filled with natural choke points, narrow paths between trees, fallen logs, rocky outcroppings. Perfect for controlling movement. Every obstacle that slowed the intruders only increased her advantage. Her breathing was steady, her mind a tactical map of the forest and the men's positions. Every decision she made would count, and she made them all deliberately. She spotted Dalton's second man trying to hide behind a large pine, rifle raised hesitantly. Avery approached silently, dropping to the forest floor and using a low crouch to remain hidden. With a sudden burst, she closed the distance, striking him with a precise, disabling blow. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. One by one, her prey fell. None had a chance. Training, instinct, and experience gave her complete control of the encounter. Dalton, frantic and increasingly desperate, realized they were being hunted rather than protected. His men were disappearing into the forest, incapacitated or fleeing blindly, and panic surged through him. Sweat poured down his face as he stumbled over roots, the rifle in his hands heavy and unwieldy. Fear clouded his judgment, making every move predictable. Avery knew exactly where he would go, and waited patiently, letting him run into the trap she had visualized moments before. She reached a natural choke point, a narrow gap between two massive pines flanked by thick underbrush. Dalton ran into it, thinking it a safe corridor. He didn't see her until it was too late. Avery emerged from the shadows with the speed and precision of a predator, striking its prey. She knocked the rifle from his hands with a swift kick, forcing him to stumble backward. His eyes widened in shock as he realized his options had narrowed to zero. "You've underestimated me," Avery said, voice calm but carrying the weight of years of battle-hardened authority. Dalton swallowed hard, fear overtaking his pride. I thought," he stammered, but Avery didn't give him a chance to finish. With controlled, practiced force, she disarmed him completely, pinning him against a tree. Every move she made was efficient, minimizing risk to herself while neutralizing the threat. The forest was silent now, save for the rustle of leaves and Dalton's shallow breathing. Avery scanned the surrounding area, ensuring no other threats remained. She could see the tracks of the remaining men, broken branches, disturbed soil, evidence of frantic retreat. She let them go for now. The fear she had instilled would keep them from regrouping immediately. Dalton alone was enough for her next step, a confrontation she knew would come. Avery crouched for a moment, observing him. His arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by terror. This was the moment she had anticipated. Control secured not through brute force alone, but through the psychological dominance that comes from experience and skill. She bound his hands tightly, securing him against the tree in a way that ensured he could not immediately escape. The wind picked up, sweeping through the pines and carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine sap. Avery's eyes remained on Dalton, calm, alert, and ready. She knew the others might still be hiding, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But they were human, fallible, predictable. Fear had already begun to rule their decisions. She had shifted the balance completely. As the sun climbed higher, streaks of light filtering through the forest canopy, Avery began to lead Dalton back toward her ranch, every step measured. Her mind was already working ahead, planning the next moves, anticipating any attempts at rescue or escape. She had not sought this confrontation, but she would see it through with the efficiency and discipline that defined her life as a SEAL by the time they approached the open plains near the ranch. Dalton's remaining confidence had been stripped away completely. He had underestimated Avery Cole, the retired Navy SEAL, who had survived countless life-and-death scenarios, and the consequences had been swift and unrelenting. Avery's calm, methodical control over the chase had turned the hunter into the hunted, the predator into prey. At the edge of the forest, Avery stopped and glanced over her shoulder. The sun now fully illuminated the plains, the soft golden light a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Dalton, exhausted, humiliated, and terrified, realized he was entirely at her mercy. He would not forget this day, nor the lesson it carried. Never underestimate someone who had lived and fought in the most lethal environments on Earth. Avery exhaled, steadying herself. The chase was over, but the night had shown her that peace was fragile. Her ranch, her quiet life, was now directly threatened by men who lacked respect, wisdom, or foresight. The events of the past hours were a warning for Dalton, his men, and anyone who might think her isolation made her vulnerable. Avery had survived before, and she would survive again, because she was ready, disciplined, and unyielding. She led Dalton the final distance to the barn, where she secured him carefully, ensuring he could neither escape nor alert the others. She glanced out over the plains, watching the horizon. Somewhere, the remaining members of the crew were fleeing, afraid and uncertain. The storm had not yet passed, but Avery Cole had already proven who commanded this land. The forest was silent once more, the chaos of the chase replaced with an eerie calm. Avery allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to reflect, knowing that the night's events were only the beginning. She had reclaimed control, neutralized immediate threats, and set the stage for the confrontation that was inevitable. Dalton's arrogance had been broken, his crew scattered, and Avery Cole remained the unchallenged force in this quiet corner of Wyoming. By the time the sun fully rose over Avery Cole's Wyoming ranch, the forest was quiet once more. Dew clung to the tall grass, and the air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. Avery had secured Dalton in the barn, binding his hands with precision and making sure he could not immediately escape. She had given him a warning through action, one he would never forget. Threatening a Navy SEAL in her home came with consequences. But she knew the danger was far from over. Dalton's arrogance, pride, and desperation would ensure he returned, and likely with reinforcements. The gravel crunch of tires on the drive alerted her before the vehicle fully appeared. Sheriff Tom Ridley, an old friend of the family and someone who had known Avery since childhood, stepped out of his truck, hat tilted low against the rising sun. His eyes immediately took in the scene, the incapacitated intruders, the tension that still lingered in the air, and Avery herself, standing calm and collected despite the chaos. "Avery," he said quietly, walking toward her, "what happened here?" His voice carried a mixture of concern, disbelief, and respect. He had heard rumors about the woman who had once been a Navy SEAL, but witnessing the aftermath firsthand left him speechless. "I handled it," Avery said, her tone steady, unflinching. She did not collaborate. There was no need. Her expression was calm, her posture firm, exuding the quiet authority that came from years of life and death experience. "They came here thinking they could threaten me. They learned very quickly that was a mistake." Sheriff Ridley nodded slowly, taking in the broken branches, the footprints leading from the forest, and the two bound men in the barn. "This Dalton guy?" he asked, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand him. He won't let this go. Not ever." Avery had anticipated as much. She had faced enemies with more resources, more men, and more firepower than Dalton could ever muster. Yet she knew he would return. Pride, greed, and humiliation made men like him dangerous. "Let him come," she said, eyes cold and unyielding. "I'm ready." There was no bravado in her voice, no thrill-seeking. She was stating a fact, the same way she had stated facts during missions in hostile territory. The sheriff studied her carefully, knowing she was not exaggerating. He had seen Avery handle dangerous situations before, but this was something different. Avery led him to the barn to show him the bound men. Ridley's face hardened. "You could have called for backup," he said. "You could have waited for the state patrol." Avery shook her head. "Backup changes the dynamics," she explained. "These men are reckless. Delaying could have cost me, or worse, the ranch. I handle threats directly. That's my advantage." Ridley nodded again, silently acknowledging that her logic, though dangerous, was sound. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines. Avery moved to the porch, watching Dalton's beaten crew stagger back into the forest. Fear had replaced arrogance in their eyes. They were human, fallible, and now fully aware of the consequences of underestimating a Navy SEAL. Avery's gaze hardened. The lesson was simple: respect or die. It was the only language some people could understand. Sheriff Ridley's concern deepened. "You can't do this alone," he warned. "He'll bring more men next time. You need reinforcements, someone to watch your back." Avery considered him, then shook her head. "No, I faced worse odds alone. This is my home. I don't need reinforcements. I need control." The sheriff sighed. He understood reluctantly. Avery Cole had always been fiercely independent, almost impossibly so. Trying to change her ways would be futile. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Avery prepared. She cleaned her weapons, checking each one with methodical precision. She polished the barrel of her rifle, checked the ammunition, and loaded spare magazines into her vest. Each movement was deliberate, meditative, and a reminder of her skill. This wasn't preparation for a fight she wanted, but for one she knew would inevitably come. Memories of past missions flashed through her mind. Long nights in hostile countries, ambushes, firefights, and the unrelenting pressure of surviving against overwhelming odds. Every skill she had learned, every instinct honed over years of combat, now applied to this place, her home, her sanctuary. She reminded herself that peace had to be protected, even if the cost was constant vigilance. Sheriff Ridley approached again, observing her calm. "Do you really think you can handle this by yourself?" he asked softly. Avery looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I've survived worse," she replied. "This isn't about ego. It's about survival. My survival and the safety of this land." Ridley exhaled, realizing that arguing would be pointless. She had made her decision, and she would see it through with unwavering determination. As evening approached, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the faint echo of distant wildlife. Avery positioned herself strategically throughout the ranch, checking sightlines, reinforcing entry points, and setting subtle traps designed to slow down anyone who might attempt an attack. Her mind moved like a tactical map, visualizing potential threats and responses. Dalton had humiliated himself before her, but men like him rarely learned quickly. The storm, metaphorical and literal, was approaching, and she would be ready. By nightfall, Avery was seated on the porch, watching the dark horizon through steady eyes. The horses grazed calmly in the paddocks, unaware of the tension building around them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, drew her attention. The ranch, her sanctuary, was now a battlefield of preparation and vigilance. Dalton would come again. He had no choice. Pride demanded a return, and this time he would be prepared to fight, though he still did not understand the full extent of the force he was challenging. Sheriff Ridley stood beside her, silent, a hand resting on the rifle he carried as a precaution. "You're not reckless," he said finally. "You're something else entirely." Avery didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Words were unnecessary. The night held its breath, and somewhere in the distance, Dalton was plotting, underestimating once more, failing to grasp the danger that awaited him. Avery took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. She had survived worse, faced death countless times, and emerged victorious through skill, precision, and unflinching resolve. Her home was under threat, yes, but she was no ordinary defender. She was Avery Cole, Navy SEAL, survivor, protector, and she would meet the coming storm with the same calm certainty that had kept her alive through every mission, every ambush, every fight she had ever faced. The night deepened, shadows stretching across the plains, and Avery remained vigilant. Dalton's return was inevitable, but the outcome was already written. He would face her on her terms, in her environment, against a woman trained to survive where most would perish. The sheriff watched silently, understanding the gravity of the situation. Avery Cole's quiet life had been interrupted, but she had made one thing clear. She would not be intimidated, she would not be surprised, and she would not yield. As the wind howled softly across the plains, Avery's gaze remained unwavering. The ranch was ready. The horses were safe. And she, calm, disciplined, and lethal, awaited the inevitable confrontation that would test every skill she possessed. The warning had been issued. The storm was coming, and Avery Cole was ready. Night had fallen over the Wyoming plains, cloaking Avery Cole's ranch in shadows. The stars hung like icy sentinels in the sky, but even their light could not pierce the darkness of what was coming. Avery had anticipated Dalton's return, had prepared every corner, every entryway, every approach, as if the night itself were a weapon in her hands. She crouched low inside the barn, silent and still, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, the subtle movements of her horses, and faintly, the hum of a vehicle approaching on the gravel road. Dalton's truck rolled up quietly, headlights off, tires crunching over the uneven gravel. He had learned something from the last encounter. He would not confront her with the arrogance of daylight. Darkness was his ally. Inside the vehicle, his crew shifted uneasily, tense and silent, aware that this time stakes were higher. Dalton's face, pale under the dim interior light, betrayed a mixture of rage and fear. He had underestimated Avery Cole once. He would not make the same mistake twice, or so he thought. Avery observed from her concealed position in the barn's loft, eyes tracing every shadow, every movement. Her rifle rested against her shoulder, perfectly aligned, sighted for the angles Dalton's truck could approach. Her fingers brushed a switch, arming the tripwire she had subtly placed across the barn's threshold. She knew this ground intimately, every board, every gap, every creaking hinge. The barn was no longer just a building. It was a strategic advantage. The first intruder, overconfident and ignorant, kicked the door open, the noise muffled only slightly by the damp night air. Avery waited, silent, letting their arrogance betray them. She did not strike immediately. Instead, she observed, noting their formations, their panic, their attempts at coordinated movement. The men believed they controlled the situation. They did not. Dalton stepped forward, rifle in hand, eyes scanning. "Come out," he shouted, his voice low and threatening. Avery remained still, a shadow among shadows. Her calm was deliberate, unnerving. She had survived ambushes where every heartbeat could be the last, where the slightest hesitation meant death. This was no different. Every movement would be calculated, every strike precise. The intruders fanned out, their coordination sloppy, their fear evident. Avery waited, letting their fear dictate their positions. She had learned long ago that panic was a weapon in itself. It forced mistakes, created openings, and revealed intentions before actions were even taken. And tonight, she had the advantage in every possible way. The first man approached a hay bale, his rifle raised, eyes scanning for her. Avery moved like a shadow, silent and swift, striking him down with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering lethal hand-to-hand combat. The man crumpled, unconscious, before he could alert the others. Dalton's crew froze, their arrogance replaced by uncertainty. They realized too late that they had no idea what they were facing. Dalton's rage surged. "Split up!" he barked, but his men hesitated. Fear had paralyzed them. Avery exploited every pause, moving between shadows, striking with surgical precision. Every confrontation was brief, controlled, effective. Her hands, trained in years of combat, neutralized threats without hesitation. By the time Dalton realized what was happening, 2 of his men were incapacitated, and the remaining were disoriented, unsure where she might strike next. Avery's mind worked like a battlefield map. She anticipated Dalton's movements, predicting his next steps with uncanny accuracy. She moved silently across the barn, shifting between cover points, watching, waiting, ready. The intruder's panic became a tool. Every misstep, every glance, every uncertain movement gave her control. The barn was no longer simply her home. It had become her advantage, her ally, her fortress. Dalton advanced cautiously, eyes scanning for any sign of Avery. "Show yourself," he shouted, frustration and fear mixing in his voice. But Avery did not give him the satisfaction. Instead, she set another trap, a tripwire releasing a loud, blinding flash of light and a sharp bang, disorienting him further. In the chaos, she moved, striking quickly, efficiently, neutralizing his immediate threat without direct confrontation. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside. Thunder rolled in the distance, masking the sounds of movement, gunfire, and shouts. Avery used it to her advantage, timing her strikes with the natural rhythm of the night. Every approach, every escape attempt by Dalton's crew was anticipated, countered, and neutralized. The barn echoed with confusion, but Avery's movements were precise, deliberate, and unstoppable. Dalton realized he was losing control. He tried to regroup, calling orders to his men, but fear had already taken root. He had underestimated Avery once, and now the full weight of that mistake pressed upon him. She was faster, smarter, and more deadly than any of them had anticipated. Every move he made played directly into her plan. By the time the night reached its midpoint, Dalton's crew was incapacitated, scattered, and unable to coordinate. Avery had established complete dominance over the situation. Her calm, methodical approach had turned a desperate attack into a controlled environment where she dictated every outcome. She moved with the precision of someone who had survived countless life-and-death encounters, someone whose every instinct was sharpened to lethal perfection. Dalton, cornered in the loft, finally understood the reality of the situation. Avery stepped into view, calm, composed, rifle aimed steadily. "This ends now," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the chaos. Dalton's arrogance faltered completely. He was forced to acknowledge that the situation had been decided long before he had arrived. The barn was silent once more, save for the distant echo of wind through the pines. Avery secured Dalton, ensuring he could neither escape nor alert others. Her strategy had worked flawlessly. The intruders had been neutralized, the threat contained, and the ranch remained under her control. She had defended her home not with panic or aggression, but with precision, skill, and unyielding calm. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Avery stepped onto the porch. Her gaze swept the plains, the forest, and the barn. The night had tested her, but she had prevailed. Dalton's arrogance had been shattered, his crew scattered, and her sanctuary secured, at least for now. The Wyoming plains stretched out before her, peaceful in appearance, but Avery knew better. Danger had been deflected, not eliminated. Dalton would return, as would any others foolish enough to challenge her. But she was ready. Avery Cole had survived wars, ambushes, and chaos far greater than a few desperate criminals. Her training, her instincts, and her resolve had carried her through, and they would continue to do so. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, watching the sunrise, painting the land in shades of gold and amber. The storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. Avery's home, her life, and her peace had been defended, and she would continue to defend them with the same unwavering discipline, calm, and lethal precision that had defined every day of her extraordinary life. The Wyoming sky darkened with the weight of approaching night, though Avery Cole's ranch remained a fortress of vigilance and preparedness. After the chaos of Dalton's last raid, Avery had spent the day reinforcing her defenses, studying the terrain, and planning contingencies. She knew he would return. Pride, humiliation, and desperation made men like him relentless. Tonight, however, the balance of power would be hers alone to dictate. Avery stationed herself in the loft of her barn, the vantage point offering an unobstructed view of the surrounding plains. Her rifle rested lightly against her shoulder, perfectly aligned with the points of likely approach. Every door, every window, every angle had been reinforced or booby-trapped subtly to slow, disorient, and incapacitate any intruders. This was no longer just a home. It was a battlefield of her design. Dalton's approach came silently at first, a black pickup creeping along the gravel road, headlights off, engine humming low. He had learned nothing from his previous encounters. Arrogance still fueled him, but now it was mixed with caution. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the landscape as if trying to read the invisible lines Avery had drawn. He had gathered a small reinforcements, men as reckless as he was desperate, all unaware of the meticulous trap awaiting them. Avery's senses were razor sharp. Years of Navy SEAL training had taught her to anticipate threats before they manifested, to read movement as easily as a map. The first signs were subtle. A branch snapping underfoot, a shadow that moved slightly too fast, a faint metallic glint from a weapon. Each signal confirmed her instincts. Dalton had arrived. The first intruder attempted to breach the barn quietly, underestimating the precision of Avery's defense. She waited, patient and unflinching. When he stepped into the zone she had prepared, a tripwire triggered a controlled series of alarms. A loud metallic clang, a flash of light, disorienting him immediately. Avery moved like a shadow, neutralizing him with a precise blow that sent him sprawling, unconscious before he could react. Dalton's remaining crew froze, panic flashing across their faces. "Move," he barked, but his authority was already undermined. Fear had taken root, and Avery exploited it ruthlessly. Every hesitation, every misstep was an opportunity. She moved between shadows, striking silently, efficiently, lethally. Her calm, controlled demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos she orchestrated, the hallmark of someone trained to control the battlefield rather than react to it. Dalton realized he had no choice but to confront her directly. He advanced toward the barn, rifle raised, eyes scanning for any sign of Avery. The previous encounters had taught him caution, but not enough. Pride and desperation propelled him forward, ignoring the warnings in the silence. Avery, observing from her loft, remained calm. She had anticipated his every move, visualized every possible path, and now she waited for the decisive moment. The final confrontation was inevitable. Dalton entered the barn cautiously, scanning corners, expecting ambushes at every turn. Avery let him come, controlling the pace. Every sound, every shadow, every creak of the wooden floor played into her plan. Her rifle remained trained on him, a silent reminder that any misstep would be met instantly with lethal precision. Dalton's hand trembled slightly as he raised his weapon. "Come out," he shouted, his voice tense with frustration and fear. Avery emerged from the shadows slowly, deliberately, her posture calm and commanding. She did not smile, did not hesitate, and did not speak more than necessary. Her presence alone communicated the danger he faced. "You've underestimated me," Avery said softly, her voice carrying authority-born experience. Dalton's eyes widened, fear mingling with disbelief. He had thought he could challenge her once more, that strategy, numbers, and surprise would tilt the odds in his favor. But he had misjudged the depth of her skill, the precision of her tactics, and the control she wielded over her environment. Dalton advanced, desperate. Avery's movements were fluid, measured, and unrelenting. She anticipated every strike, every approach, every defensive maneuver. Her hands, trained in years of combat, moved with lethal grace. Each blow, each parry, each calculated step brought Dalton closer to realization. He was not facing an ordinary opponent. He was facing a predator whose patience, precision, and experience surpassed anything he could comprehend. The barn echoed with the subtle sounds of struggle, a gun clattering to the floor, a grunt of exertion, the rustle of clothing as Avery pivoted and struck with surgical precision. Dalton's confidence disintegrated, replaced by raw fear. His men, witnessing his inability to control the encounter, faltered further, confusion and panic overtaking them entirely. Avery's strategy was complete. The battlefield was hers, controlled from start to finish. Finally, Dalton fell to his knees, the weight of failure pressing down. Avery trained her rifle on him steadily, ensuring there was no further threat. "This ends now," she said, calm but resolute. The words carried the weight of inevitability. Dalton's pride, arrogance, and desperation had been crushed, and he understood, perhaps too late, that his challenge had been a fatal mistake. Avery surveyed the barn, ensuring no other threats remained. Every detail had been accounted for: incapacitated intruders, neutralized weapons, and controlled environment. The night siege, the culmination of Dalton's reckless arrogance, had ended exactly as she had anticipated. Her calm, methodical precision had turned chaos into control, fear into a tool, and arrogance into submission. Outside, the Wyoming plains stretched endlessly, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. Avery allowed herself a moment to breathe, her mind already analyzing the lessons of the night. Dalton would not return immediately. Pride would force him to lick his wounds, regroup, and plan. But she had demonstrated the consequences of underestimating her, and that message would linger far longer than his next move. Sheriff Ridley arrived quietly, alerted by the distant noise of the final confrontation. He surveyed the scene, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. "You've done it again," he said quietly, almost reverently. Avery nodded, calm and composed, her eyes still scanning the horizon. "It's not over," she replied simply. "It's never over. But tonight, this is controlled." The sheriff understood. He had witnessed Avery handle chaos with a level of skill, patience, and precision that defied belief. Dalton and his men had learned the lesson, the hard way. The threats against Avery Cole were not merely dangerous. They were suicidal. The night had been a crucible, and she had emerged unscathed, victorious, and in full command of her environment. As the first hint of dawn touched the Wyoming horizon, Avery checked her weapons one final time, ensuring everything was in order. The barn was secure, the ranch fortified, and the immediate danger neutralized. Dalton's arrogance had been broken, his crew scattered, and Avery Cole had once again proven why you never, under any circumstances, threaten a Navy SEAL in her home. Her gaze swept the plains, the pines, and the horizon beyond. The night had been long, dangerous, and exhausting, but it had also reaffirmed a fundamental truth: preparedness, precision, and unwavering calm were her greatest weapons. Dalton had returned, confident and reckless. Avery had defended her home with the discipline and lethality that had defined her life. The final standoff had ended, But the world beyond her ranch remained unpredictable, dangerous, and unrelenting. And Avery Cole, calm, disciplined, and unyielding, remained ready for whatever challenge, threat, or storm might come next. The first light of dawn spilled over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. Avery Cole stood on the porch of her ranch, surveying the aftermath of what had been a long, harrowing night. Her breath was steady, her posture calm, but inside, a familiar pulse of adrenaline lingered, a reminder of the battle she had just fought and won. Dalton and his men had been decisively neutralized. Bound, disarmed, and humbled, they were now in the custody of Sheriff Tom Ridley, who had arrived just in time to witness the final confrontation. Avery had ensured that the law was involved, but it was clear that the night's events had been handled on her terms. The intruders had learned the hard way why you never threaten a Navy SEAL, and the lesson was etched in their bodies, minds, and pride. Sheriff Ridley approached, his hat tilted low, eyes scanning the horizon before settling on Avery. "I've seen a lot in my years," he said quietly. "But that was something else." Avery allowed herself a brief, wry smile. "It's not about bravado," she replied. "It's about control, discipline, anticipation, survival." The sheriff nodded slowly, understanding that her calm exterior concealed a mind honed to react and adapt faster than anyone around her. Inside the barn, Dalton sat slumped, defeated and silent. His crew, equally broken and humiliated, avoided his gaze. They had underestimated Avery Cole, and the consequences had been swift, brutal, and precise. Avery didn't gloat. She had no need to. The battlefield had spoken for her. Actions, not words, were enough to convey the lesson. The sheriff stepped in to ensure proper procedure was followed, leaving Avery to her own reflections. The ranch was quiet now, serene in the early morning light. Avery walked through the paddocks, checking on her horses, feeding them, ensuring they were calm after the night's turmoil. Every movement was deliberate, meditative, a return to the peace she fought to protect. She reminded herself that her life, though filled with danger and chaos, was anchored by these small, grounding routines. Survival required discipline, not just in battle, but in everyday life. As she walked toward the barn, Avery's mind replayed the events of the night. Dalton had been relentless, reckless, and arrogant. Yet, every misstep, every attempt at intimidation had played into her hands. Her years as a Navy SEAL, the training, the missions, the moments when survival hung by a thread, had prepared her for this exact situation. She had anticipated, planned, and executed with precision. The outcome had been inevitable. Dalton's gaze met hers as she approached the barn. There was a flicker of fear, respect, and disbelief in his eyes. He realized, too late, that his challenge had been doomed from the start. Avery said nothing, allowing the silence to speak volumes. The lesson was clear. Arrogance and underestimation were fatal mistakes when faced with someone trained, disciplined, and relentless. The sheriff, now overseeing the detained men, glanced at Avery and nodded. "You've done more than protect your property," he said quietly. "You've shown them what it means to cross the wrong person. That's a lesson they won't forget." Avery's expression remained neutral, but inside, a quiet satisfaction settled. This was not victory in a traditional sense, but it was absolute control, the kind of resolution that left no doubt and no loose ends. As the sun climbed higher, Avery prepared the ranch for the day ahead. She checked her weapons, secured the barn, and reinforced any remaining weak points. Her actions were meticulous, methodical, the same discipline that had guided her through every mission, every ambush, every life-or-death situation. Avery understood that true preparedness was ongoing, not momentary. The world was unpredictable, and vigilance was the only reliable defense. By mid-morning, the sheriff had taken Dalton and his crew into custody, leaving Avery alone with the ranch, the plains, and the quiet hum of life resuming after the storm. She allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, to feel the sun on her skin, and to appreciate the calm she had fought to preserve. This moment was hers, earned through discipline, skill, and an unwavering commitment to survival. Avery's thoughts turned inward. She reflected on the lessons of the past night, the importance of anticipation, the value of calm in chaos, and the necessity of controlling every variable in a confrontation. These were not abstract principles. They were the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. Avery had lived these lessons countless times, and tonight had reaffirmed their truth. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly before her, serene and unthreatening in appearance, yet she knew better. Danger would return. It always did. Men like Dalton, fueled by pride, desperation, and ignorance, would attempt to challenge her again. But Avery was ready, prepared, lethal. Her mind and body were honed to respond faster, smarter, and more decisively than anyone who dared threaten her home, her life, or the peace she fought to protect. She walked to the edge of the ranch, gazing across the horizon. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the quiet resilience of the land. The night's battle was over, but the vigilance required to defend it would continue. Avery felt a surge of clarity. Survival was not a single moment of triumph, but an ongoing commitment to discipline, preparation, and control. Returning to the barn, Avery carefully cleaned and stored her weapons, ensuring each one was ready for the next challenge. She reviewed her plans for the property, checking perimeters, sightlines, and potential vulnerabilities. Her actions were deliberate, meticulous, and thorough. Every detail mattered. Every precaution counted. This was not paranoia. This was preparation. This was the life of someone who had survived the impossible and emerged stronger every time. As the morning sun rose fully over the plains, Avery allowed herself one final glance at the horizon. Dalton and his crew had been dealt with, the ranch secured, and the lesson delivered. But she remained aware. Vigilance was never optional. Peace was a prize earned through discipline, skill, and unwavering resolve. Avery Cole had proven once again that she possessed all three. With the wind carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, Avery breathed deeply, letting the calm wash over her. The dawn of victory was hers, not just because she had survived the night, but because she had maintained control, discipline, and clarity throughout the chaos. The world beyond her ranch remained unpredictable, but Avery Cole remained steadfast, ready for whatever storm might come next. She stepped onto the porch, the sun warming her face, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The night had tested her, threatened her, and demanded her best. And she had risen to the challenge, with precision, with skill, and with the unwavering calm of a Navy SEAL who understood that true victory was not just survival, but mastery over the chaos that sought to destroy it. For now, the Wyoming plains were quiet, the ranch secure, and Avery Cole, disciplined, lethal, and unyielding, stood ready. The dawn of victory had arrived, and she had earned every second of it.